It's not often in horror fiction that the monster talks to you. Not often that you get to see the way he thinks. The reason, of course, is that it's so much harder to write horror fiction from the monster's point of view. But what this monster tells you is that he can't help it. He wants all the things that you want. Love, sex, food, friendship, family, home. He wants what you want. He just doesn't want to follow the same rules to get it.
The Kill Fix by Richard Kadrey. I go for the woman, but her companion sees me and reaches for something under his coat. Inhuman reflexes. But I eat inhuman for lunch. The woman's heartbeat whispers to me, tells me secrets. The man's mouth moves, talking some animal language of pain. The snapping of his bones sounds like the breakup of an ice floe, a lonely, faraway sound. I leave him twitching with the magnum still in his hand. Then the woman and I are one, dancing on a carpet of shattered glass in the alley behind the club, locked in a slow-motion waltz. My teeth in her throat, her blood filling my belly. Jewels, I think, honey, sweat, love. My heartbeat slows as the thing in my head feels her life going. As it goes, she makes a low, unsurprised sound as if she has been expecting me, or somebody like me, for some time. She finds death a release, and she's right. Her death has released me from my thirst, and the thing in my head purrs like a fat, contented cat. I leave her body in an overflowing dumpster. Then, burning with her life, I vault a low wall and climb, my heels slapping, rolling across the rooftops. Maybe you've seen me among the TV antennae and satellite dishes. The slaughterhouse Baryshnikov. I've seen you often on the bus, moving by in trams or pedicabs at 4 a.m. Mostly you don't see me. I could be anybody. I sweat blood and mercury and disguise myself in the flash colors of schizo subway hieroglyphics. Each graffito is a plea and a warning. Are you listening? I am. Those times when you do see me, we acknowledge each other with our eyes, communicating in that strange, hushed speech of the early morning, the heavy silence of steaming manhole covers and empty office tower lobbies. Neither of us can stand words, it's obvious. Still, I can't help wondering who you crossed, what you could have done to make them send me for you. At night, I feel your heat. I know your heartbeat because it's my heartbeat too. They gave me your heartbeat and told me to find you, to hunt you down by the rhythm and smell of your life. If I don't kill you, stop your heart, I will die in your place. My body will give out. I cannot live with this alien heartbeat for long. They didn't bother telling me your name. There's a thing in my head, bright as chrome and smooth as polished jade, shaped like a bullet. It hums deep in my brain like a cocoon restless to release the thing inside. It changes me, thins my blood, scrambles my thoughts, hardens my eyes to fists of bright black ice. When they switch me on, I can see your bones and marrow, smell the life in you. Variegate erythropoietic porphyria. Yeah, the clockwork vampire. That's me. The men in the suits give me the Lugosi treatment when they want, send me out to kill, then turn me off through the bullet in my head. Hemofluxing, they call it, in accents that echo Harvard and Bangkok and Texas. Trust me on this one point. When they turn me on, it's better than dope. Better than speed or sex or music. They own me with it. The men in the suits have become my collective mother. I suckle on the thing in my head. They birthed 13 of us altogether. 7 women, 6 men. A prime number, the number of a coven. Real cards, these government boys. They brought us back to the States and put the vampire bullets in all our heads. Gave us eyes that went dead when we were switched on. There's 11 of us now. Soon there won't even be that many. I suppose that's why I'm here flying in this luxury tin can, moving at Mach 3 across the South Atlantic, telling you this. Years ago, I lived in water, Clean, white vaults of Antarctic ice 1 mile straight down. Below the acid fogs and radiation leaks and cancerous fish. The bottom of the world, so far down that the walls still held fresh H2O fossilized as ice. We were volunteers, 13 cons among hundreds, on work furloughs from San Quentin. People were paying opium prices for that water, locked away from industrial waste and the dying ozone layer by 1,000,000 years. But professional hydrominers would have taken too big a bite out of the profit margins of the cartel sponsoring the dig. So they got us. A sweet deal all around. They got their water on the cheap, and we got a week knocked off our sentences for every day we worked. They stenciled our prison IDs on the backs of our insulated worksuits. The microglass fibers smelled of mildew and urine and old sweat. Sealed inside the bulky suits, we were sexless. Behind our respirators, faceless, blind grubs, burrowing through white glacial meat, looking for a way out. I ran a cut-and-lift rig, heaving great slabs of the ancient underground seas from the walls and dropping them onto conveyors where they were hauled away to the processing rooms. I remember the suspended profiles of prehistoric fish and flowers, red dazzle of LEDs off the polished umbilical couplings and the oxygen tanks, the Russian heads-up display I couldn't read. I felt at home and free and secure there. And at night I dreamed only in tones of silent white. Once a week we showered. No lights in there. The guards wore night vision goggles and carried cattle prods and mace. Men and women washed together, shuffling in 2 long rows under the spewing heads. Cheap acrylic patches marked the textured hull of the place, black and bulging like infected skin. I could always make her out in the nervous fluorescent lights of the exit, moving by in the opposite direction behind the tattooed woman and just before the short-muscled man. At night, we bunked on padded pallets in curtained tiers of scaffolding. I traded bunks with other cons, trying to find where she slept. Took the highest, filthiest perches in the place, where the padding had all but rotted away before I tracked her down. When the man in the adjoining bunk refused to trade, I crushed him under the treads of my lift rig during the next work shift. The foreman put it down as an industrial accident and requisitioned another worker to take his place. It had not occurred to me until I moved on to the pallet next to hers that the woman and the muscled man were lovers. I would lie there at night and listen to them, their quick and shallow breathing, the snake sound of her skin on his. I introduced myself and learned their names, Cale and Diego. She had a smile that was all canines, one of those women who can draw blood just by looking at you, chew you up and suck the marrow out of your bones, and you thanking her all the time. Cale was hooked, I could tell. Later, when I thought about it, I saw that he was the perfect candidate for hemofluxing. Even back in the ice, Cale's eyes had had the hard, dull look of that cheap costume jewelry you find in Hong Kong street stalls. Cale was Diego's pet. Sit up and beg, dear. Which doesn't mean she didn't love him. She liked me, too. At night, when Cale was off getting blown on the video games, I'd move on to their bunk. She liked me to rub her feet, working on the tight muscles of her instep, her ankles, making my way purposefully up her calves, thighs, to the blonde down of her belly. She'd touch the back of my head and tell me how much she liked my hair. I'd kiss her palms then and tell her fortune, making up stories for her. Sometimes Cale would come back and watch me working on her. He'd sit there at the far end of the bunk like some slow-eyed gargoyle with his knees drawn up to his chest as I spread my fingers across Diego's legs or the small of her back. He would never speak, just stare at us with those blank TV eyes. Then I'd go back to my bunk and Cale would take over. Unlike him, I didn't like to watch. Once at night, I was holding on to one of the support struts outside my bunk, concentrating on the sounds she made, those round and strangely musical Tagalog vowels, when her hand moved from their curtained pallet and wrapped itself around mine, held on to me the whole time. The veins in her wrist betrayed the tempo of her animal heart. Without wanting it, I had a clear and sudden vision of Diego as a child, grabbing onto Mommy's or Daddy's hand at the Manila Zoo. Wrapped in heat stink of melting candy and animal sweat, terrified of being swept away into the crowd of strangers' legs. Then felt the sudden pressure as she gasped the last few sudden syllables from beyond the curtain. I wondered then if I was being groomed as her new pet. In our 10th month of frozen captivity, the men in the suits came for us. In the city, it was easy to be invisible. During the day, I slept. At night, I would hunt, always careful to return to my apartment by dawn. The place was outfitted with special windows, double layers of polarized glass. Sometimes I would watch the clubs as they locked up in the morning. It scared me to look at them, so hollow and dumb in the daylight like the frozen eyes of fish. But then night would drop down over the roofs, and the eyes come alive, winking at me, like the girls on the corner in their heels and tube tops as they whispered the price of love to the tourists. Girl skin the fashionable color of cataracts, ears sparkling with ripe clumps of tinted glass. And I was out there wading through them, letting the steaming tide of faces lick and break around me, listening to their hearts. It's not so easy to be invisible in this damn jet. The bright-eyed young executives across the aisle keep sneaking glances at me in my little darkened corner of the first-class cabin, thinking I'm some eccentric mafioso off on a retirement jaunt. I've killed many like them, crushed their stupid pink faces in my hands. When I own their heartbeats, I own them. Listen, their bones are the ice I cut from the earth. The men in the suits had faces like these, transparent postcard faces you could hardly see, faces that were impossible to remember. They paid the cartel cash for us, selected us 13 from hundreds by means of some computer model, breaking down our personality types, our crimes, and physical and intellectual attributes. We went with them because we were told to. Didn't know who they were, and they volunteered nothing about themselves. I still don't know who paid my rent. CIA? KGB? The phone company? Sometimes on the WorldLink news shows, I would see the faces of people I'd killed for them. A Korean biochemist, a neo-expressionist painter, a Taiwanese porn actress. What could these people have in common with each other? What could they have in common with you? A confession. The first time I ever really felt alive was the first time they switched me on. I awoke in surgery, remade with a voice in my head that told me secrets through the bullet in my brain. The voice told me to hunt and showed me how. He was a Times Square hustler with a pixelated tattoo that flickered from a Maori design to a geisha to some corporate logo and back again. I picked him out of a weekend crowd of hundreds. Took him to one of those big hollow theaters, him looking at me funny the whole time, neon caught in his eyes. At first I was nervous, terrified that he might not be the right one, but I could hear the staccato rhythm of his heart, smell the musk of his bones. His hands were on my legs, thinking I was shy. When I bent close to his face, he closed his eyes, leaving his throat exposed. That's when I took him, and came to life at that moment, thinking, the sea is salt, and once I mined the seas. Blood is salt. Blood is the sea, and it lives inside me. I sucked him dry and felt a hammer come down between my eyes, dropping me out of myself into some boiling liquid slipstream. And all I could see was a rhinestone dangling from the kid's earlobe, porn flaring off the cheap crystal like microwaves dancing off tin cans at the bottom of the ocean. The men in the suits left nothing to chance. When they wanted us, they'd turn on the things in our heads and we'd come running to them, wet and electric, giving off sparks. Up to their penthouse lofts in wood-paneled elevators with piped-in muzak and shiny brass handrails marked with dull islands where our nervous hands had scraped away the finish. They worked Cale and me the most, which was fine by me. We drew a salary, but murder is mostly piecework. The men in the suits loved data. loaded us down with diskettes, long green reams of printout and digitized photos of whoever's heartbeat they'd given us. Then there'd be medical records, financial statements, voice prints, gene prints, retinal scans, federal, state, and company IDs, lists of clubs, lists of lovers. The men in the suits loved data because they liked to pretend we were all cops in pursuit of some higher ideal and not just paid death. Back home, I'd dump most of the junk in the shredder and go out with only the photos in my pocket. The shot they gave me of you shows you smiling in a tennis dress. There are palm trees behind you and a flat blue Mexican sky, but the tropical sun dazzling off your skin and white dress makes you look cool, like you're clothed in some impenetrable snowbank. Don't misunderstand me. Sexual desire isn't the point here. There are 4 pints of blood in the average adult human body. You're doing fine, but I'm running on empty. Get the idea? Cale was in Cairo, taking off some visiting German fusion entrepreneur. Diego and I were checking out shops in the village. Quaint to die for. She bought a matte black butterfly knife and studied her reflection in the storefronts, holding the blade up level with her eyes, making movie tough guy faces, flicking it open and closed with a practiced casualness. We bought beer at a corner deli, and she told me how one night she'd slit her mother's throat with a knife like that. Said she'd been born in one of those Mindanao baby farms, to a woman artificially inseminated with local sperm. Baby Diego headed for the U.S. prefab family market. They'd rounded her eyes and cooked out her melanin with nanoprocessors injected directly into the placenta. The little molecular devices had affected her eyes, leaving her left pupil permanently dilated. Her U.S. parents had returned her. The child hadn't quite fit their family ideal. Could they trade her in for something else? They sent me out 3 more times, she said, but the mommies and daddies always sent me back. When she was older, the farm sold her to a club outside the U.S. Naval Base in Subic Bay, where there were lots of daddies who wanted her. She said, I learned how to dance and roll a joint and work them hard with my hands so that later they'd come fast. One night she'd ripped off one of her Johns and used all the credit on his chip to book a flight for the States. Before she'd left, though, Diego dropped by the Lebensborn to carve her birth mother a second mouth. The cops were waiting for her when she landed in Honolulu. She shrugged as she told it. I was just a kid, she said. And I couldn't tell if she was sorry for killing Mom or for getting nailed for it. I bought her a set of knuckle dusters from a leather queen on Houston Street. They were too big for her hand, but she managed to hook 3 of her fingers in the proper holes, letting her pinky dangle in the opening between the rings and the curved brace that pressed against her palm. Then she laid the knuckles along the side of my jaw. Did you really kill your mother? I asked. She smiled. No, my father. He molested my sister and me, so I blew him away with his hunting rifle. That a fact. Actually, Mom and Dad run a taco stand in Dallas. I got popped for selling PCP cut with arsenic to a cop's son. In the video display in a shop window, I could see her pressing the metal to my jaw from a dozen different angles and slightly out of register. I wondered what kind of story she'd told to hook Cale. Is it just me, I asked, or do you like to fuck with everybody's head? She smiled and took the knuckles away, kissed me where she'd held them. Only you, dear, she replied. It wouldn't be special if I did it with everybody. She stole the last cigarette out of my coat and smoked it as we walked home. Thinking about it now, it seems like the kind of wild animal game kids play with each other without ever thinking about. When I was 6, we lived in Queens and rode our bikes around unlit parking lots all night, trying to knock each other over in the dark, weaving like ghost bats between the concrete barriers at the end of the parking spaces. We told each other that parking lots were old paved-over cemeteries, and that the yellow lines marking off the spaces were put there so people could find the graves. Diego, God, I want to see her now. Want to put her back there in that white space where I found her. Crack my skull and let it all run out, all that whiteness I used to dream of back in the mines. That was Diego I was dreaming of, not the white itself, but her moving there, underneath it all, pulling the strings and making it run. White of knuckles all those times I dreamed of hitting her. The white of fossil fish, ice white, crank white. The white of teeth and surgical masks. White of new moons and phosphenes, stuttering fluorescent white, spark white. Each tiny nova hotter than hell, but too small to make any difference. Pus white, larval white, the white of surrender. Eye white appearing between half-closed lids when she'd bite her lip, shake, and breathe those short percussive vowels. The three of us were like those kids in the parking lots. Quick flash of steel in the dark, laughing and flying blind across a broken chain-link landscape. Diego used Cale and me, and we let her. We used her, too, forming a kind of perfect loop. The only perfect thing I've ever done. Sometimes I wondered if the men in the suits knew anything about us. They seemed totally blind to what we were doing to each other between jobs, acting out these ritualized murders of each other's desires. At other times, though, I'd think that I'd gotten it all wrong, that the men in the suits knew exactly what we were doing, that they'd planned it this way, breaking down the pattern of our mutual addiction into a binary expression of absolute need, feeding it all into some government mainframe and watching us run, plotting our actions as data diagrams and flowcharts, a perfect arc of obsession. Could it have happened that way? Could it be that the computer model that placed us here in this place at this time incorporates algorithms so complex and subtle that they can predict the very shapes of our souls? I suppose it's possible. But after the men in the suits were all dead, it was too late to ask them what went wrong. I was on the back end of a 2-week job in Sydney, skull-blasted and cross-eyed, blown through the dateline and half a dozen time zones on one of those Tinker Toy Burmese suborbitals. You know the type, 10 Gs, no waiting. Everything was moving in dream time by the time I hit Kennedy, so it took a while to work through the static when the men in the suits told me she was gone. We rode in the company car. I stared out through the smoked glass and changed channels on the radio, trying to find something I liked. Finally, I settled on an Arab newscast on one of the World Link stations, turning it up loud enough to drown out the men's irritating chatter. They finally shut up and dropped me at my apartment. Inside, I threw my bag in a corner and sat in the dark for a long time, massaging a gnawing ache at the base of my skull. Around dawn, I woke up with spiders cakewalking across the surface of my brain and a strange new animal beat working my heart. I sucked in air and started to cry because I suddenly knew what the men in the suits had been trying to tell me, and just whose heartbeat they'd saddled me with. Lately, I like to think that Diego had been trying to tell me what she'd sensed about my true role in our little troika, setting the wheels spinning in some unlit antechamber of my unconscious, with her stories about the Lebensborn and the sailor she ripped off. Maybe trying in her own way to make it easier for me, by letting me know that it was nothing personal, that it was just the way things were. She had to run, and I had to follow. That's when I realized that she'd done it again. Replayed that bad old night in Subic City. Lay down with whoever the men in the suits had set her on, playing him like one of those vague and faceless tricks, leaving him broken-necked and penniless in some $500 a night furnished suite. Diego Braga. The last time I saw her, she was lying next to poor broken Cale in a dumpster. The gun still in his hand, my teeth marks on them both. The men in the suits told me what they knew before I killed them, too. Diego and Cale had never stood a chance. The guy she took off was a courier from some Swiss banking heavies, moving funds for men who had a deep and spiritual relationship with other people's money. When Diego killed the guy, when his distinctive brainwave pattern stopped, it activated a simple cortex implant, immediately freezing all his assets. The credit chip Diego took off him was so much dead plastic. Couldn't get a shoe shine with that thing, much less a plane ticket. I found the two of them coming out of a club on Bleecker Street, where they'd been trying to sell the Swiss's credit to some local chip hackers. We danced together then, three of us, in the alley, on a carpet of broken wine bottles and fluttering leaflets we painted the town red. 20 miles up and halfway around the world, I can still feel your heat. The stewardesses give us pillows, coffee, and our choices of 3 grades of recreational neural stimulants. We'll be landing at Bird Station within the hour. An adventure at the bottom of the world, the video at the tourist office said. Witness white-capped vistas older than man himself. It'll be easy to lose these tourist assholes once we've landed and cop a snowmobile. I still remember where the hydrominers store those big transports out on the tundra. With one of those, I'll be able to get far enough into the mountains that they'll never find me, and I won't be tempted to come after you. That's the difference between Diego and me. I wanted to get away. I don't know if death was what she was really looking for, but I do know that in the end, she didn't care either way. The men in the suits didn't have to give me her heartbeat, but they did. Diego and Cale didn't have to remain in a city I knew so well, but they stayed. How like her to have hung around, playing on the thinnest ice she could find. Or maybe she didn't think about it at all. Maybe she was just another fuck-up like me. I don't believe very much anymore. I only know this. The reason I'm here, the reason I killed the men in the suits, is not because they switched me on and sent me out to do my friends. I could have spared Diego and Cale in the same way I'm going to spare you. Sit up straight and smile. I'm willing your heartbeat back to you. I don't want it anymore. Can't bear the weight of it. No, when I'm honest with myself, I know the reason that I killed them all was not because Diego chose Cale, but because she didn't choose me. A subtle difference, but an important one. But I'm in old territory here. Maybe this confession is just my stumble-bum try at turning off the bullshit detectors once and for all, and hope that the guilty ghosts will follow. For now, I'll put their faces in my pocket with all the other faces I've taken, and keep running. The men in the suits had bosses too, you know. And they didn't like what I did to their boys. No, not one little bit. I left a fortune's worth of that bottom-of-the-world water lapping at the edges of their penthouse. Gallons of it. Watched it turning pink around their bodies, soaking into their monogrammed shirt sleeves, floating strands of hair and shredded reams of printout. I cleaned myself in their $1 million water and left that church-quiet meat market closing the door behind me. Sacked out on soft leather in first class. A few seats ahead of me, drunken middle management types are coming on to the stewardesses, and I'm thinking that I'd like to tear out their skinny pink throats. The thing in my head is growling at me, telling me I'm hungry and how easy it would be to open you up and drink you down. All I have to do is turn around. A cute trick 20 miles up. The farther I move from you, the more desperate the thing in my head becomes, till it's buzzing in my brain like a wasp trapped in a bell jar. This light is agony. My skin is curdled milk. When I hold my hand up, I can almost see the bones beneath. You'll never know how hard it is for me to leave you. If it wasn't for the dope the smiling stewardesses keep handing out, I'd never make it. The recreational stimulants work on the limbic system, exciting glutamate receptors in the hippocampus and amygdala. Memories blow and burn like smoke. Imagine fast-flipping channels on WorldLink, each image superimposing itself on the one before. Kids on bikes, fossilized fish, glittering butterfly knives. I remember being sick just before my flight to Sydney. At the time, I'd thought it was the flu. But now I know it was the sickness of separation. Diego was cutting the cord and setting me adrift. I was in the bathroom, splashing water on my face, when she came in, closing the door behind her. She touched my hip and unzipped me there by the sink, wrapping her legs around me. We made it there on the floor. Hours later, going through customs in Australia, I could still smell her skin on my hands. The white tile had been cold and bright behind the spiked fan of her hair, like the walls of the ice mine years ago, and when white appeared for a moment between her partially closed lids, I had the electric vision that the back of her head was a globe of clear crystal. I still dream of that sight, thinking that if only I could have found my way inside of her skull, I might have cut out whatever drove her and stopped her from running away. Out the port window, I can see the ice fields of the South Polar Plateau. I can still feel her moving underground, drawing us together there under the ice on those worn and wooden pallets. I move my hands across her back, digging in the blizzards and ice flows of her flesh, hold her there in that moment, listen to her stuttering climax with someone else. Just before she leaves me, she takes me on the floor, spreading her robe and sliding over me like the shadow of a crow, pulling me to her. Chilled tile along my back as she tugs my shirt over my head. I'm drunk and snowblind, catching her face in slashes of color that burn like the inside of my skull. The thing in my head is cooking me, and I'm afraid. When I touch the ground, my footsteps will boil holes in the ice. Someone will follow me, and I'll have to dance with them the way I danced with poor Diego. But before I do, before we sink together into that endless white, I'll say it to them once so that they'll understand. I'm home.